Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. I'm Susan Demas, the executive editor of Lincoln Square, and I'm so pleased to have Leah Litman joining us today. In addition to being a University of Michigan law professor and a former Supreme Court clerk, Leah is also the co-host of the amazing podcast Strict Scrutiny, which you should check out. And she also writes about the courts for outlets like the Washington Post and the Atlantic, and Slate. And of course, you should not miss her new book that just came out, Lawless: How the Supreme Court Runs on Conservative Grievance, Fringe Theories, and Bad Vibes. You can see a copy of it right in back of Leah. And that was an instant New York Times bestseller. So thank you so much for being here. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm super excited to do this.
Great. Well, I definitely want to get into your book, but just first, I have to imagine that because you have to be such a detailed court watcher and a watcher of this particular Supreme Court, that's a lot sometimes. I mean, do you ever feel like it breaks your brain to do that all the time?
So it is a lot right now. And I actually think covering and watching the court has become even more complicated in the era of the shadow docket because you used to kind of at least have 24 hours or so advance notice before getting a decision. Whereas now you can get a really significant ruling at any particular moment. And you
Right.
add to that this court doesn't even always finish by the end of June. So I can't even plan my summer vacations or Supreme Court wrap ups around that. And that's even putting aside the absolute crazy making substance of some of the rulings. So I think if I was doing it alone, I wouldn't be able to process it, and that's part of what both the podcast and the book are designed to do. You know, the podcast, I have my co-host, and so we are able to engage in some kind of gallow humor with each other. And then the book is designed to kind of foster the sense of community to make people feel like I am not alone. It's not just me thinking these guys are pretty wild.
Right. Yeah, I did want to talk to you about the shadow docket. Maybe you could walk us through exactly what that means. Because, before June used to be kind of the March madness of court
Yeah.
watchers. You'd have like all these significant decisions coming down. But they ruled on the Texas abortion law, with just like one sentence a few years ago and essentially ended abortion in Texas. And so we're seeing such significant decisions come through with like so little accountability and explanation. And that does seem to be a change.
Oh, it's absolutely a change. So, Steve Vladeck, who is a professor at Georgetown Law School, has a book, The Shadow Docket, and he's documented the rise in the use of the shadow docket. And that just refers to the set of cases or decisions that the court makes without oral argument, without full briefing, and again, without announcing a decision in advance. So, it really picked up steam during the first Trump administration when the Trump administration started asking the Supreme Court for what's called emergency relief, basically asking the Supreme Court to pause or put on hold lower court decisions that had blocked the administration from carrying out some of their policies. And as the Supreme Court willingly granted those requests, the Trump administration just started making more of them. And so, of course, other people did as well. So, yes, that has led to a rise in really significant decisions on the shadow docket. They don't always issue opinions, they might not state their reasons. And that has been, I think, a real change over the last decade in Supreme Court practice.
Interesting. So it's kind of like executive signing orders, but for the judiciary.
Yeah, you can definitely think of them like that. It's almost like the ultimate encapsulation of ruling by fiat. You know,
Hmm.
there's like this form of like Kotti justice where individuals would stand before, the ruler and hear their case, and then the ruler would just pronounce, you get a goat, right? Or like, you get this. And you don't know why they're doing this, except they do. And it has these profound dramatic consequences. I mean, just in the last 3 weeks, two shadow docket decisions have rendered something like close to 1 million people without legal authorization, forcing them to be undocumented and potentially subject to removal. And those orders came on the shadow docket. We didn't know they were coming in advance, and they're without explanation.
Right. Right. Yeah, so it really seems to have helped Trump fast track a lot of his policies in a way that, previous administrations have not, had that sort of advantage. But at the same time, there's been, some growing tension, obviously, between the judicial branch and the Trump administration, which is interesting. And so, looking at your book, um, you give us a pretty stark, although very funny look at how the current Supreme Court operates. And it's been a green light for Republican power. So, I mean, this did not happen overnight. It didn't just happen with Trump. How did we get here? For me, as a non lawyer, it seems like the Bush v. Gore decision was a bright line.
Yes, so that is honestly the moment when people ask me, when was the sudden shift? I say Bush versus Gore. That's an instance where 5 Republican justices stopped the count, 2
In
decades
2000.
before in 2000, 2 decades before Donald Trump was rage tweeting to stop the count in the 2020 presidential election. And they ordered the state of Florida to certify the winner of that state's electoral votes as George Bush, leading him to become president. And that, I think, embodies the kind of lawlessness that I write more generally about the book. It's a decision that the justices declared was good for that case and that case only. It also had the profound effect of declaring a Republican president and giving Republicans political power, even at the same time that it risked disenfranchising minority voters. So, yes, I think Bush versus Gore was a big moment for the Supreme Court. But I think the story I write about in the book is partially a story of changes in the Republican Party as well as changes in our democratic institutions. Because really, I think over the last almost 70 some years, the Republican Party made several conscious choices where they decided to appeal to a narrower segment of the country and sacrifice trying to appeal to racial minorities or women voters or the LGBT community or people who weren't as well off economically. And so that led them to basically depend on minority rule as a way of obtaining political power. And the Supreme Court, of course, is a pretty counter-majoritarian institution. And so they needed the Supreme Court to carry out their minority rule agenda. And they went about this 5 decades long effort focused on whipping Republican voters into a frenzy about the court and then engaging in a process where they could identify the justices who they felt would adhere to the Republican Party line.
Right. And so, traditionally we have, thought of conservatism as, limited government, and that was kind of the overarching principle. But with this court, you kind of paint a picture of them being driven not as much by that traditional conservative ideology, but like this real feeling of conservative grievance. And, it's kind of odd for those of us that, aren't one of those 9 people in the white robes with like this immense power to think like, what does Samuel Alito have to feel, so aggrieved about? But it seems very real. And more than that, it seems like that is kind of the backbone of a lot of their legal reasoning, certainly more than precedent.
Yes, so that's why conservative grievance is in the subtitle of the book, because I really do think that is a through line across the 5 different broad areas of law I talk about in the book. So, this idea of conservative grievance maintains that basically the core constituency of the modern Republican Party are the victims of a society that doesn't share their views and, even worse, sometimes criticizes them.
Yeah.
And they view that as an affront to them. And so they see, well, when society doesn't share our views, that means we are now a minority. And
Hmm.
as a minority, we deserve some judicial protection. And that leads them to, let's say, in the area of LGBT equality, where a majority, a supermajority of the country now is on board with marriage equality. In recent decisions, that will lead the Republican justices to say, well, now these views that marriage is between a man and a woman are so unpopular, that means that people who have those views get to have exemptions from civil rights laws
Mm.
or are entitled to share those views, without criticism. And so it's that idea that I think is behind the law on LGBT equality now, the law on voting rights, the law on campaign finance regulation, on administrative state and regulatory powers. And Justice Alito constantly trumpets those ideas in any forum in which he appears.
Right. And we've seen just so many more public appearances, for justices than we ever have. Before, there used to be this unspoken rule that, justices did not want to weigh in on politics, especially any issues that might be before the court. But now, Samuel Alito would probably show up to a moose lodge, in Alpena, Michigan, just to talk about the fact that he feels that he's being oppressed by liberals because some people are mean to him online. And is there really any way to get that genie back in the bottle, or are we just in this state of perpetual politics everywhere?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's no doubt that as a country, we are polarized in that people's views do tend to track, to a pretty significant extent, the party with which they are affiliated. As far as getting the genie back in the bottle, I don't know that that is something we can necessarily snap our fingers and just change. But what I do think is in an era of partisan polarization where you might predict that the justices will more reliably reflect the views of the party that appointed them, maybe that is a reason to try to transfer more decisions to the branches of government that are actually more democratically accountable to the
Hmm.
people so that when the party makes decisions that track their own views, then that party can be held accountable for them. And sometimes, that's going to inure to the benefit of the Republican Party. Sometimes that's going to inure to the benefit of the Democratic Party. But at the end of the day, we should want institutions that are making such significant decisions to be accountable and responsive to the people, I think.
Right. And yet we've seen, especially with this current Congress, that they seem more than willing to cede their power to the executive or to the courts as long as they go along with them. Which is interesting because, with our system of government, it was conceived as three equal branches, with the legislative branch considered to be the most important. And yet, um, we certainly in the current makeup are not seeing that, which may account for some of the power imbalances. Um, I also wanted to get to another part of your title. It's not just conservative grievance. There are also bad vibes, which I'm sure when you went to law school, that was not part of anything that you studied in terms of what goes into a judicial decision. So, how did we get here?
Yeah, so maybe I'll just say a short bit about what I mean by bad vibes and then explain a little bit about how we got here. So, bad vibes, I just mean to draw a pretty pointed contrast with law. So, vibes are more someone's feelings or the zeitgeist of the political party or the talking points of that party that appointed them. So, conservative grievance is like one of the vibes that I see the Republican Party, modern Republican Party, and these justices to be running on. But more generally, it refers to them just putting their feelings and talking points into the law. And I'll just
And
give one.
conspiracy theories, as you've
Oh,
said.
yeah. And fringe theories are part of there as well. So happy to give examples of any of those, but just one quick example of the vibes. So, in the recent decision where the Republican justices invalidated Joe Biden's student debt relief plan, they declared they were not going to apply their usual rules of statutory interpretation, i.e., textualism, focusing on the words of the statute. They said, no, we're going to apply our new made up rule, the major questions doctrine, because student debt relief generates feelings that are personal and emotionally charged. So they're literally using the Republican Party's feelings as an opt out, right,
Mhm.
of the law and textualism. And so the book goes through different examples of what I see as that phenomenon, how we got here. I think that goes back to kind of what we were talking about before, which is the Republican Party came to depend on minority rule and
Mhm.
came to search for justices who would be willing to do whatever was necessary to enable Republican Party's political power.
Yeah, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that because, for decades, Republicans have really concentrated on getting justices from the Federalist Society, although now I guess Trump is feuding with them as well, which you feel free to wade, wade into, because perhaps nobody had that one on the bingo card. Um, and, as a way like, well, look, electing 435 members of Congress, that takes a lot of time and money. You're not always going to win the presidency, but we've got nine justices who sit on the bench for life. Well, that's a branch of government that's easier to capture, and they set their sights on that very early. It seems to me, again, as a non-lawyer, especially back in the 70s when you would have like a Republican president like Richard Nixon ended up appointing some of the justices who became very reliable, quote unquote, liberal votes on the court, which did not go over well. And that's really paid dividends for conservatives, and not just at the Supreme Court level, but all throughout the judiciary.
Yes, no, definitely. So I'm glad you brought up Richard Nixon because I think that that is a really clear example of the phenomenon that, you're describing because during that era, the Republican Party in the space of electoral politics, they were willing to support the Voting Rights Act. Richard
Hmm.
Nixon didn't originally want to renew it, neither did Ronald Reagan, but the country believed in civil rights and voting rights. And so they were ultimately forced to do so and to sign renewed Voting Rights Act. But what did they do? They searched for justices who would be willing to invalidate the Voting Rights Act. Richard Nixon was actually quite explicit about this. So, as he was courting the votes of segregationists, he promised not to appoint justices who would, quote, treat the South like a whipping boy, specifically in the context of voting rights. So
Hmm.
this was a conscious effort, again, recognizing they didn't have majority support, the country's support for their views, to use the institution that didn't depend on majority support and accountability. The feud between Trump and the Federalist Society is, of course, just the latest and best example of he has no real ideology. The only thing he cares about is power. And
Hmm.
anyone who makes a deal with him, right, because they think they can get something out of him, is eventually going to be jettisoned because at the end of the day, like what he cares about is loyalty and his own power. And there will be times when that aligns with different groups' interests or they're willing to bend the knee or make that bargain. But
Hmm.
there is no one and nothing he will not throw under the bus, from decency to democracy to the rule of law, in service of his own power and authority. And I think it was clear the Federalist Society made this deal where they were willing to support him, stay quiet because they really wanted some justices on the Supreme Court and judges on the lower courts, and they got them. And
Hmm.
honestly, I think they're going to continue to get a lot of that. The first round of judicial nominations that Donald Trump made, I mean, his pick on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit is the former law clerk to Justice Alito, Barrett, and Kavanaugh. So, he's still going with the Federalist Society types. It's just he's also throwing in an Emile Bove here and there as well.
Right, right. And it seems like, definitely on certain issues, it was a good bet for conservatives to, look to stack the courts because, I don't think we would see Congress take the extreme actions of just overturning Roe v. Wade, for instance, in 2022. It's very hard to muster up those kinds of votes, but on a court of nine, not so difficult. And it's been interesting to see with this court that John Roberts is now voting with the liberal bloc on some things, but you were talking specifically on voting rights, and that is an issue that he never seems to bend on. He is very passionate about the fact that we do not need a Voting Rights Act and we should be restricting voting in any which way we can. And so, even with a justice who's considered to be a consummate politician, more reasonable on a lot of these very core conservative issues that would be hard to get through Congress, you can still count on the Supreme Court, whether or not they agree with Trump on everything.
I think that that's exactly right, and I think, honestly, that is part of why I think the Republican Party is going to balk at Trump and Vance's and Miller's suggestion that they should just disobey court orders and
Mhm,
sideline the court entirely, because I think they understand that for the most part, and in a lot of very important areas, the Supreme Court and the federal courts are their friend, and they need the court to do things, while a Democrat is in the White House or when Democrats, win Congress, or whatnot. So I agree that I think a lot has been made of the departures that John Roberts and Justice Barrett have made with the Trump administration, but I think deeper reality is they laid the groundwork in many ways for the Trump administration and what the administration is doing. And they don't seem to have a lot of second thoughts, even about their immunity decision. Just in the
mhm.
last few weeks, they allowed Donald Trump to fire the heads of multi member commissions in violation of federal law. Basically, the president sidelined the court's previous decision in Humphrey's executor because he thought the court would let him get away with it because they didn't
And they
like
did.
that case too. And they did, exactly. So I think that yes, there are some cases where they're going to rule against the administration, but I think all that says is just about the extreme asks that the administration is making.
So, one of the big cases that we're all looking at will be birthright citizenship, and the court is largely expected that they will not, you know, rule in Trump's favor on that one. The 14th Amendment is extremely clear. Um, but you don't see a scenario where the Trump administration will just defy such a court order and will create this extreme, crisis of the Constitution?
So it's not something I would like rule out entirely,
Mhm.
but it's not something I see them doing immediately, including on birthright citizenship, for I think two reasons. One is that in some ways they've already kind of found ways to evade court orders and judicial review without saying explicitly and outright that they are disobeying court orders. I mean, consider the reports of the United States citizen babies that have been deported since the
Right.
administration claims, their parents, consented to that when that's very much in dispute. Or cases where the federal government tried to cancel funds for different agencies. And then they came back and said, okay, well, we didn't cancel them with one uniform policy. We just happened to individually review every single grant and conclude that on their own terms, the grants shouldn't be renewed. It's like, well, that's
Right.
highly coincidental.
Mm.
So they seem to have learned how to get what they want without explicitly embracing outright non-compliance. And this is something I actually just wrote an Atlantic piece about. But I think that that is where they're putting a lot of their energy, time, and focus right now.
But at the same time, you do get all this bluster, especially from Trump himself, because intimidation is kind of his stock and trade. And obviously, a lot of judges are feeling nervous. I mean, there's been talk about that the U.S. Marshals can't properly protect judges, so they need their own security force. I mean, that's pretty radical.
That is super radical. And I think we should understand, the statements, the public facing statements that Donald Trump is making that you were alluding to about possible outright noncompliance as part of that intimidation
Hmm.
campaign, when he's calling out individual federal judges on Truth Social, as well as his attorney general is doing. So all of that, everybody knows will lead to a rise in threats against those particular judges and judges writ large. I think threatening noncompliance is another way of basically trying to bully the courts into ruling for him.
Right. What are some of the decisions that you're looking at coming out in the next few weeks? We year after year, it's just been kind of a trail of tears at this time of year. Is this going to be any different?
No, I think this is going to be very similar. I'm definitely watching the birthright citizenship case. I think the Supreme Court is going to limit lower courts' ability to use nationwide injunctions to block the administration's policies, though not eliminate them entirely. And that could mean a pretty significant shift in what lower courts are able to do to enforce the law against the Trump administration. Also, watching for the case on LGBTQ inclusive reading materials in public schools. So, that case, Mahmoud versus Taylor, is about whether parents can claim a constitutional right to opt their children out of instruction involving storybooks with LGBT characters. I think that that would create a bunch of problems for public schools, which
Hmm.
just don't have the resources or time to create individualized curriculum or separate classrooms for all the many different students with parents of different views. And then there's a case about the Voting Rights Act, Louisiana versus Calais, and whether states can attempt to comply with the Voting Rights Act or whether complying with the Voting Rights Act is itself a form of unconstitutional racial discrimination, which is the argument in that case. And then there's any of the Trump cases, which might be decided. We just don't know.
Right, right. So, so much of our lives get decided by, these nine justices, at this point. I mean, that may not have always been the case, but I mean, there are so many significant cases these days. Um, Are the courts subject to public pressure? Are there things that we can do as citizens? Because, it's very frustrating for so many people to just sit and watch as like our rights get stripped away.
It is very frustrating. So I guess what I would say is they are partially subject to public opinion. I think it's no accident that the year after they overruled Roe versus Wade and their public approval ratings plummeted, they held off on embracing a radical theory that would have ended what remained of the Voting Rights Act. They held off on embracing an extreme version of the independent state legislature theory that was an idea
Right.
behind Bush versus Gore. So I think it can do something. Um, I, I understand the desire to want to do something with like an obvious return, so you see your work paying off. But part of the lesson of the book is changing an institution like the Supreme Court takes decades.
Mhm.
It's not going to be a single straight line. There are going to be setbacks along the way, but it is still worth it. And in the interim, you can see progress, maybe by focusing on state and local races. State and local judges can do a ton to limit the damage that Supreme Court rulings can do. Saw that in Wisconsin. We saw that here in Michigan. And in the meantime, I think we should all think of ourselves as public educators to try to inform other people about the court so that there's a different constituency of voters who actually wants a party to appoint judges who will follow the law, not follow their feelings, and not launch a retribution lash out campaign against large portions of American society.
Right. And I know for years that, the Supreme Court was one of our most revered institutions, and, that it was popular with a bipartisan audience. You really could not see that cleavage as you do in so many other institutions. But, they definitely have taken a hit, especially after their Dobbs decision. Am I correct on that?
No, absolutely. They saw dramatic dips in their approval ratings. And I think this is part of the precarious situation we find ourselves in as the Trump administration is flirting with noncompliance. The court has squandered so much of its public support that might have chilled an administration from flirting with or experimenting with noncompliance.
One last thing before you go, I'm just wondering what was one of the stories about any of the justices that you learned in investigating things for this book? Anything that would surprise people or maybe be a little amusing in these dark times?
I'm not sure I have a super amusing, happy story in these dark times, so I'll say something I learned in the book, and then I'll maybe try to tell a super short, amusing story. Okay, so something I learned in the book was a memorandum that went between the justices when they were deciding an important Voting Rights Act case from the 1980s, in which Justice Lewis Powell spoke to his colleagues about how he wanted to rule against the Voting Rights Act in that case, because if he didn't do so, it would turn our cities into jungles. And the explicitly racist, right, language was quite striking to see, from a justice in the 1980s.
Hmm.
Um, the amusing story is when I clerked at the Supreme Court, I admired Justice Ginsburg. And one day I brought her in cupcakes when we were supposed to have our tea with her. And so I presented her with these designer cupcakes I made, and she looked at them and said, "You can give those to my law clerks. We will just eat my cookies." And so we sat and ate stale cookies in her chambers, while my designer cupcakes just
Oh,
went to waste. I know. She had a sweet tooth. I thought I was doing something awesome. Turns out she was unimpressed.
but she always she was like doing intense workouts to the very
Oh, yeah.
end. So she might have looked at those beautiful cupcakes and decided, I can't go there.
But that's the thing. She had such a sweet tooth. Every week after the justices' conference, you would see her walking back to chambers with the leftover tray of cookies. So
Hmm,
she's eating cookies and whatnot. She just refused my cupcakes.
hmm. Who knows? But the fact that you were able to have tea with Ruth Bader Ginsburg is a great story in of itself.
Yeah.
So, um, everyone, you should definitely get Leah Litman's book, Lawless. We only got to scratch the surface on everything. If you've ever read her writing, even if you're not someone who really enjoys going through court decisions, which, let's be honest, how many people do, she will cut through everything, tell you what's important, tell you what can be done, how we got here. And really, it's such a crucial story today with the court having so much power. So thank you so much for being here. I appreciate it. And I really hope that you'll come back and see us.
Happy to anytime. Thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone.